Greetings from Washington, D.C. My name is Irfan Nuruddin. I'm the director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council and professor in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. On behalf of my colleagues at the Atlantic Council and the South Asia Center, it is a pleasure to welcome you today to the second launch of our new US-India trade report, Reimagining the US-India Trade Relationship. Co-authored by 4 distinguished non-resident senior fellows, Dr. Harsha Singh, Mark Linscott, Anand Raguraman, and today's moderator, Ms. Ritika Batra. This report attempts to position the US-India trade relationship in a new context, not just focusing on what can be gained, but really on how to get there. What are the structural and institutional impediments to a more productive US-India trade negotiation so that we can unlock the potential of a deeper economic partnership between these two large economies? The conversation today will focus on the Indian perspective on the US-India trade relationship. Very often in Washington, it is easy to focus really on the US concerns and hopes for the relationship, while giving short shrift to what Delhi, what India wants out of that same partnership. And so today we're going to focus very heavily on how India sees the US trade relationship, what are its frustrations, and what are its aspirations for a deeper partnership with the United States. Coming on the heels of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Delhi, this discussion could not be more timely. And I'm very grateful to non-resident senior fellow Ritika Batra, who is also vice president for Mahindra USA, for convening this conversation. In a second, she will introduce to you our panelists, Mr. Sohail Nakami and Dr. Shamika Ravi. And a little later on, Ms. Sumaya Keynes of The Economist will join the discussion as well. But for now, we welcome you. We hope you will ask your own questions through the Q&A function. And over to you, Ritika.
Thank you so much, Irfan. I am really, really glad that we have 2 star panelists who would give us a perspective on India's trade relationship with US specifically and India's trade ideology in general. But let me first do an introduction for both of them, although I'm sure that people who have joined know Shamika and Sohail very well. But just as a courtesy and as formality, I am going to do a little bit of a readout on their profile. So Shamika, she's a non-resident senior fellow at the Governance Studies program at Brookings Institute, Washington, D.C. She was the former director of research at Brookings India, and her research focuses on economics of development, including areas of finance, health, urbanization, and gender inequality. She was also a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. Sohail, he is a lawyer. His expertise is in M&A, regulatory, security law, trade, and competitive law. He has a very broad understanding of Indian businesses and challenges faced by foreign companies investing in the country. Sohail has very successfully represented India at the WTO disputes before the panel and appellate body in Geneva as well. And he was also a council member for the Competition Commission of India. With that introduction, I am going to first invite Dr. Shamika Ravi to say a few words about her views on the report that we did with 3 of my other co-authors. I hope she found it informative enough. And then I would request Shamika to speak about the ideological differences between India-US and trade relationship and what her view is and what are the gaps that can probably be bridged. And then I would move on to Sohail. So over to you, Shamika.
Thank you, Ritika. Thank you for this very generous introduction and the invitation to be here with this stellar panel. Congratulations to the authors for putting together, I think, which is a very timely, but I must say very realistic, and that is what I really liked about this report. I think instead of, making very large, broad-brushed assumptions on where this relationship ought to be, because there is a great deal of posturing on both sides, I think. And yet we know that time and again, there have been frustrations. There is a lot of meeting of minds when it comes to the overall intent. And I think that is what you see when political leaders meet and you have large conferences with this regard. And yet really very little comes out of a lot of these events. And I think towards that, this report is really a reality check. It puts out very simply, very squarely where the differences are, fundamentally in terms of the institutional biases, the historical baggages that both the countries come towards this problem with, and therefore the situation we are in. So I think from that perspective, for me, this was extremely enriching. I really enjoyed reading a report. I can't say that for many trade-related reports, but this one I must congratulate that I think it's very, very crisp. It's not verbose, and I think it's timely, and I think people will read it.
Thank you.
Now, going beyond, to the larger question of why we end up where we are, I think people do know that India has been struggling with trade negotiations. It is not limited to the US alone. In fact, if you look at trade to GDP, so the relevance of trade as far as the larger economy is concerned, we've been seeing a decline and a steady decline since 2012. So this remains a larger demon that I think Delhi, and for those of you who are new to the Indian economy is not just determined from Delhi. The state's vibrant 28 state economies are very much a part of a lot of these negotiations. So this, I think, is a longer term structural trend that needs to be broken. I think the understanding is that trade is important. We have seen even within our neighborhood, countries do very well on the back of excellent trade agreements, which work for the real economy. And by that, I mean, it's not just value addition, but job creation, technology transfers. So I think there is a recognition that we need it. And towards that, I think a lot of people talk in the same language as far as the intent is concerned. But again, I think the frustration comes from the fact that, one, I think there is a capacity gap when it comes to technical details. I think it's very important to recognize that a lot of the arguments that you hear in favor of trade vis-a-vis specific countries, and here I think, larger liberal democracies and the strategic talk that you hear on India and the US talking together, talking similarly, I think the problem is that we don't have champions of fostering these kind of agreements. What we have are theoretical arguments which are thrown at people. And this is where I think a lot of it is within my own community. We put out theoretical arguments for why trade has succeeded in South Korea and a lot of the Asian, East Asian countries, and therefore we should open up and we should have these kind of agreements. Unfortunately, backed by very little empirical evidence. And I think that is where the fear and the uncertainty plays out. And being a large democracy, you've seen how the farm laws, despite 30 years of economists across party lines speaking in the same language, saying, yes, we need these farm laws. They're very good for the economy, but you had a standoff. You had some parts, some regions, some states, and now increasingly political. So that is the reality of how economic reforms or nuances of real economic, not just financial market, but when it matters, larger demographics. We saw during the RCEP as well that there was a considerable backlash, particularly from the dairy sector. You had the large groups anchored through the Swadeshi Jagran Manch. But I think the feelings or the sense of fear was widespread. It wasn't limited to just a small group. So I think we are not selling trade and trade agreements enough. And I think that is where the knowledge gap comes in. I think we don't do it because we haven't put together sufficient empirical evidence. And again, that is where I think this report is helpful, because you do lay out, where the gaps are and what needs filling. So I think that's important. What also came across very well, Riddhika, which I do appreciate, is why thinking small can be very powerful in a situation like this. That instead of large radical agreements, incrementalism, gradualism is really the way this relationship is going to proceed. So I think working towards that is important. Though there is a large segment even within India which does make the case of the opportunity cost of lost time and therefore lost job opportunities and growth and so on and so forth. But there's no getting away from the reality of the politics and the decision making in a democracy such as ours. So I think this report is helpful. I think this needs to be communicated. I think it was also very refreshing to read Mark Linscott's view when he said that, look, negotiations and trade agreements with India is not a priority for the US. And I think it's important for that reality check to also sink in amongst Indians and Indian policymakers to realize that, look, there are buses, of course, but you're likely to miss buses because it's a highly competitive atmosphere. But I think more knowledge, more empirical evidence, more research will go a long way towards fostering this particular relationship. I think cooperation between regulatory bodies is such an underappreciated idea. And yet I think that really holds tremendous promise. If we do have, beyond business organizations, if we have regulatory bodies beginning to work together and we create those forums where they can come together and discuss, I think a lot of the fear and the uncertainty around what these agreements are meant to capture and what they're likely to, I think will be dealt with. So I think I do congratulate you for putting this together. I think it needs to be widely disseminated and discussed. And I'm, of course, happy to take further questions.
Thank you so much, Shamika. I'm so glad to hear your thoughts about the report, but I will definitely also add, I'm tempted to say this, that when we started on this journey of putting the co-authors together and writing the content, we were determined that we are not going to list out specifications of what sectors do need trade negotiation, what are the low-hanging fruits, what's the data around it, because we all recognize that there are foundational mismatch on ideology and approach from both sides, and that's what needs to be addressed, and rest can fall in place. So thank you so much for your comments on the report. I am going to save the other questions for later, but I'm going to invite Sohail to share his remarks, and then I'll go into Q&A with both of you, but I have lots of questions for Shamika already. Thanks, Sohail. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you, Riddhika. Pleasure to be on this panel with Shamika, Somaya, and Irfan and yourself. I had a great time reading the report because, as Shamika said, it tells it as it is. There are lots of things that culturally we don't discuss in India, but truth be told, we have been very, very slow in our trade engagements, not only with the US, but in fact, globally. And India has a notorious reputation, for lack of a better word, for not signing on the dotted line. And we've been in prolonged negotiations with several countries. And while we are beginning now to move along from the old approach, we are still not moving fast enough. If you look at the history of trade engagements in India, we've always used it as a tool for diplomacy. And India's earliest agreements were, around Bangladesh to recognize the government that came in after the 71 war, including in Afghanistan soon after the Soviets left. So it was used as a tool for establishing diplomatic relationships. And the sense was that, look, India is bringing this market access to these smaller economies. Of course, we did SAARC, but for various reasons that was dead in the water. And we continue to have ASEAN engagements, but we are still on the periphery of ASEAN. The agreements we've signed with Japan and Korea and Singapore are good agreements, but not good enough because trade is not growing at the speed that we want it to grow at. And I appreciate this report for reasons that Shamika said, that it brings and tells it like it is and brings different perspectives to the table. So Mark's candor in saying that, look, really, this is not important, or this recognition of what Shamika called incrementalism, it's true, because you're going to have to deal with India possibly very differently than you deal with most countries looking for an FTA. So, um, just to go on, over the years, of course, the 1980s with Rajiv Gandhi's historic visit, and then more recently with the, um, I guess, affinity between our leaders, we've seen a lot of good talk about trade relations and how we need to engage more and where we need to engage more. I can tell you this: living in India for 2 decades, more than 2 decades now, after living in the US for the longest period of time, I'm seeing advertisements for California almonds, Washington pears, apples, and a lot of American produce in the daily newspaper. So, of course, the first wave brought the Kellogg's and the Pepsis and the Cokes into India. Now we're actually seeing the import of food coming into India, but certainly nice to see, but far from living up to its potential. India remains the ninth largest trading partner of the US, and the US, of course, is either the second largest or the largest, depending on what data you go by for India. But the imports and the exports that we see between the two countries are still, in sectors which have been traditional. And I think the world has moved on, and so have our economies. And that is not reflected rapidly enough in this new global order. And when I talk about the long advocated that, look, I think multilateralism is going to take some time to come back. And now we need to engage in a bilateral or a regional world. India, for various reasons, is not able to push the regional agenda as much as some other countries in other parts of the world. But the fact of the matter here is that bilateralism is the way that India can continue to grow its exports. And as Shamika said, if you see trade as a percentage of GDP, India has not done the best of jobs in the world. And this is something that we need to work with large markets like the US, maybe the EU, where we are engaging in bilateral trade, which really makes a difference. So India's exports, largest exports to the US are precious stone and metals. And, when GSP went, that was a sector that was hurting. And we have pharmaceuticals, which is the generic drug market, but really nothing uh, uh, that needs to come with this new economies that we are all looking to transition to. The US, of course, has their largest exports to India in mineral and uh, fuels into India, and those are all traditional export sectors. But what is the problem? What is preventing these two countries, which has a stated ambition to become closer trading partners, have geopolitical commonality, from lifting the game, for lack of a better word, on trade? Of course, India has historically had high tariffs, has been protectionist of its own market. We can argue on that. Shamika made the point on agriculture, where she said vibrant 28 states looking at trade agenda. Agriculture is completely a a state-driven subject, and market access over there is going to be very, very difficult. We had in the past engaged in some trade posturing. I use the word posturing over negotiation on imports of poultry, and there are just several issues at the state level which you just are unable to overcome that easily. Don't also forget that we are the two largest democracies in the world, which is great, but that means everybody has a point of view, and the moment you start making progress on certain types of negotiations, you will run into a situation where you uh, have a government that is changed. So, we had the Trump regime, and his personal equation with Modi is well documented for everybody to see. But there's a change in government. We're lucky that Biden has an equally good relationship, maybe not as showy as the previous one, but we're still on a good, to use a cricket analogy, on a good wicket, so we can still proceed ahead with the urgency it requires. But there are many bugbears in the relationship: IPR, services, non-tariff barriers, data and digital trade. So localization of data has become a big issue in India, and honestly, it's not going to go away anywhere soon. In fact, the world is becoming more and more protectionist about its data and how it's accessed, and the largest tech companies who stand to lose the most are American companies. So there are going to be some very, very tough negotiations, but there are lots of areas where we can play a role, and that's what I like about the report and this concept of starting slowly and then building big. But there are some things that I know you refrain from using low-hanging fruits, but climate change, technology, access to healthcare. And look, we had two opportunities to sign something on trade which we missed. And I think one of the papers in the report does say how trade negotiators will rue the opportunity of having missed signing something, both when Trump visited India or when the Howdy Modi event was there. But today we have, sadly, to use it as an example, a great opportunity with COVID, because through COVID also, there's a lot of trade that is going on. And in fact, today, Secretary Anthony and Minister Jaishankar said it in their press conference. Not enough of talk about trade, but certainly said about supply chain on COVID and how to become suppliers of vaccines around the world. And, speaking of the press conference between the two high-ranked officials, they spent a lot of time talking about geopolitical realignments. Three issues. Of course, the immediate concern is Afghanistan. They both shared a point that we don't want to see Afghanistan as an exporter of terrorism. We don't want to see Afghanistan as an exporter of refugees, and we all want a stable Afghanistan. Two was the whole reality about China and the Quad and whatever is happening in the so-called arc of democracy in Asia. And of course, now COVID throwing up this opportunity to build, I guess, supporters in the region, because China has done a great, quote unquote, job of exporting its vaccines, whereas countries like India, where we've had a shortage, and countries like the US, which have not been that forthcoming in the early days with exports, had a slow
Sohail,
start.
I'm just going to.
And we cannot also get that the last point.
Okay, go ahead.
Ritika, the last point. Okay, so the other point I just want to put in perspective is that while we were doing this, there was a high-level visit from China to Afghanistan, and the statements that have come out from the Taliban there certainly, cannot be ignored by both the countries. So that's it. I'm sorry I took a few minutes extra, but I just wanted to
No problem.
make these points from an Indian perspective.
Thank you so much, Sohail. Thanks, Shamika. I am going to invite Somaya from The Economist to ask a few questions of the panelists from their perspective, their overview that they have, and then I'll moderate the session. Over to you, Somaya.
Thank you so much, and for having me be part of this. So one thing I'm super interested. Sohail, you said that trade has been used as a tool for diplomacy, right? And I feel like in the conversations there's a sort of a set of geopolitical issues that have come up, and then there's trade policy that's sort of on a different lane. And I guess my question is, where do you see those converging, right? Where do you see trade policy being kind of directly affected by the geopolitical developments, right? So from the US perspective, it seems like a lot of policy is being designed to sort of deal with competition with China, right? Are there any areas of US-India trade policy that where that is relevant? To both of you, what are your thoughts? Sohail, should we start with you?
Samaya, I lost your question somewhere in the middle. Can I ask you to repeat it? I know it was long, but if you could
so how do you
repeat
see
the question, where do trade?
How do you see geopolitical objectives directly influencing sort of the specific asks within trade policy? I guess specifically with respect to China, how is the geopolitical rivalry between the US and China influencing the conversation in the trade space?
So, of course, I'll leave defense out. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Go ahead, Sohail, maybe you can.
Okay. So leaving defense out of this, that of course is the biggest example. But if you see what is happening in the telecom world, and you see how the Chinese suppliers had dominated the Indian market through the 90s and early 2000s, all that is completely changed now. India will not acquire any equipment from China, whether it's near the border or away from the border. And now there is a whole new regulation in India on trusted source suppliers of telecom equipment. And I think several American companies are benefiting, as are several European companies. So Ericsson, ECI from Israel, US companies, Motorola, and that's an example of just a large chunk of trade moving with geopolitical reality. And you're seeing it in the 5G debate today, where equipment is being sourced from by several countries.
Shamika, what do you think?
So Sumaya, it's an excellent question, and I think the convergence really happens with China. I mean, vis-a-vis China. I think that is the gorilla in the room. I think it's very important to recognize that India-US relations, not just strategic but also trade, which we are interested in today, is largely driven by both these countries' relationship with China.
Mm-hmm.
The US-China trade war has had deep implications for India. In fact, a lot of the ease of doing business reforms that states are trying to bring about, or at least the inspiration, the motivation behind it is that, look, the US-China trade war is likely to lead to disruption in supply chain. So we should be ready. We should get our house in order that we can attract some of these firms that are looking to relocate. So I think it's driving relationship largely from the strategic point of view. We've had these border issues with China over the last year and a half. And unfortunately, I think that is the reality of India's strategic interest today. We cannot look at economic relationships and trade in particular without considering the implications it will have on India, China, and India, US. So I think China is where this converges, to give a short answer to your question.
Great, thank you. And I just have one more question before I want to hand it back, which is digital, right? So there's a lot of trade policy beyond a full-blown FTA, right? And there were reports the other week about how there's potentially interest in some kind of digital agreement with members of the CPTPP. Do you think that there is even the remotest possibility of some kind of narrow US-India digital agreement to kind of cement that partnership? Or is it just too tricky in the Indian context? Shamika, should we start with you?
Sure. I think, Sumaya, right now it's a bit tricky. I think we should be, again, realistic that conversations, I think there is heightened interest in the tech space. I think the realization that India is a very big market it plays out in India's favor, but we also do know that there is a considerable pushback from Indian tech industry. And we are seeing this, whether this is the fintech or the larger e-commerce or the larger tech industry. We do know that Indian interests are going to drive these conversations. And I think, again, when we make these arguments, it's theoretical. Why? It's, efficiency arguments are what overriding a lot of these discussions. But the reality of a democracy like India is that it will eventually be economic and strategic interest of Indians and sort of, the local industry, which is going to be the overriding component here.
Sohail, what do you think?
So I agree with Shamika that, India is not going to give large digital access into the country. And we're seeing those battles play out every day. American Express, MasterCard, Facebook, Twitter, they're all seeing, for different reasons, a huge pushback in India. Please also consider that given that the Chinese market is close to American tech giants virtually, India is a huge market for them, but India is going through its own issues around technology and digital and access to markets, and it's going to take a while to sort out because that's a huge opportunity for Indian industry. And just to make a point that Ritika made, you need to see where industry is. And one of the problems with India is that industry doesn't play a big role in trade policy, but you can't say that about technology because NASSCOM is very, very active and at the forefront of this. So I think it's going to be a little difficult to negotiate those agreements at this point in time.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand back to Ritika now. Thank you. Thank you so much for having me as part of this.
Thank you so much, Somaya. Those questions were very, very informative and the answers equally.
Thank you.
I am going to start with a few questions with Shamika, if that's okay. Shamika, you brought to light something that I have been very passionately talking about for the last few years. And in fact, I have mentioned that in my report as well, that there is a lack of data, there is a lack of empirical study, and there is a lack of motivation to sort of put things together and do an informed decision-making trade negotiation on India's behalf. Do you think that the government of India recognizes that and there is an intention to fix it? If yes, that's great. If no, why not? That's my first question. I'll stop here.
So Ritika, I don't want to speak on behalf of the government, but my sense is, as someone who's been watching the space, my sense is there is a realization that the capacity is low. And you will see that in terms of the engagements that the Commerce Ministry has with research institutions, with consulting firms. I think, but again, this is not limited to commerce and trade alone. I think this is it's sort of a more widespread structural problem. And frankly, the space isn't very well evolved either. I mean, it's not like when the government goes out looking for experts to help them shape some of these agreements. There is little evidence. It's just been the nature of, it's just that we have very little data and research on specific aspects of the economy, the real economy. So we are seeing that in terms of COVID. We are seeing that in terms of just general healthcare access. We see that in terms of trade as well. And of course, now we do have institutions which are putting together. There are several centers now, new centers that have been established, whether it's at the Foreign Trade Institute, whether it is at ICRIA. I mean, so we do have a body of work being put together, but not the kind of real-time, data and information that you need for precision policy making that you're talking
Correct.
about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I hope that that sort of happens sooner than later. Let me ask you a question from the USTR's perspective, the current day USTR. Of course, most of these government institutions are driven by the ideology of the sitting government at that point in time. And we see, I see that one of our co-authors, Mark Linscott, is also in the panel. So I would encourage him to ask a question if he wants to, specifically on the thing that I'm about to say, if he has a comment on that. The current USTR is slightly different from the previous USTR under the Trump administration in the sense that there are topics like diversity, inclusion, labor, and environment, which are taking front and center position with the current day USTR in their trade negotiations. There is an ideological shift as well, philosophical bias, if I can call it, that, multilateral trade deals have not benefited US as much as they should have. And that's the ideology that most of the Dems sitting in the Congress and all of that is concerned. So there is a growing effort from the White House to talk about trade, which doesn't necessarily need congressional approval, so to say. Why do you think that is going to have an impact on India-US trade relationship, and how do you think that is going to have an impact on trade relations between India and US?
Well, I'd say putting an ideological spin to discussions which have already, Ritika, been dragged on for a very long time. So it's not due to lack of effort. I think the basic differences and the institutional biases or the historical sort of baggages are significant. So if you're going to throw in this new variable, I think it is likely to make the Indian side a little more edgy. I do think it worsens the uncertainty around a lot of these negotiations, and I think in any case, the minute the stakeholders go beyond if we are to include a wider set of sort of spectrum of stakeholders, it goes, the uncertainty just increases. So I think, I think that might be one reason why we might have to be more patient, with the current discussions.
Following up on that, we see that the Quad has taken a lot of importance with the Biden administration in just the last 2 or 3 months. Correct me if I'm wrong, but when the Quad conversation started a year ago, Australia was dragging its feet, Japan was the most active, India was sitting on the fence just watching everything as a spectator, and US was just in and out every time there was a Quad conversation. Things are very different now, with all the 4 countries being very active in the conversation, and hopefully sometime towards the end of this year, we would see a Quad meeting in Washington, DC. At least that's what I hear. There is a conversation around Quad, including trade conversations as part of the Quad meetings. Why do you think that is happening? And what benefit would that bring to the 4 countries involved and the rest of the world, you think?
So I think, Ritika, the way the Quad has been shaping, and there has been an acceleration, you're absolutely right, is largely shaped by the pandemic and the aftermath, and the kind of widespread tragedy that democracies have faced. I mean, we know exactly the kind of rioting and unrest that most large federal democracies have faced on account of this pandemic. And I think that is bringing these partners together. But I think where I think they have made significant progress is in terms of having very definite steps forward. And I think, whether it is in terms of manufacturing vaccines, whether the Johnson & Johnson is going to produce hundreds of millions of doses out of India for the developing countries, I think these kind of specific steps take the intention towards an obvious outcome. And that is well appreciated. And I think that's another thing that I liked about the report, where we say that we have to highlight the positive cases. It's not that this experimentation of the last 2 decades has come up with nothing. It's not true. There have been several successes. But I do think the frustrations have overwhelmed the discussions, where this coordination problem again sort of remains central. And so I think highlighting some of those positives, the Quad is one such. And I'm quite optimistic in terms of the frequency of the meetings. Of course, again, and as scholars, we can have very free discussion on it. A lot of it is guided by the threat, strategic and economic, that China imposes. And this is why we need these discussions, rule-based negotiations, and what it means. So to your earlier point on US, the belief amongst citizens there, that and of course that does work out and is felt in terms of election outcomes as well, that trade has not benefited a very large part of. That is definitely not the case in India. We have benefited from trade. And that is why it worries us, those of us studying the economy, that trade as a proportion to GDP has been declining. So trade, the relevance of trade, the significance and the promise, the opportunity that it holds, it has to be realized for an economy which is $2,100 per capita per year. So we are still, we're having a discussion as equals when it concerns strategic interests. But we also have to realize that being a low middle income country that has just come out of poverty, our realities are very different. So I think that adds to the excessive carefulness and wanting to build consensus, I think, within the country, though we have benefited from it. But I think no negotiations are likely to be hasty. But as far as the Quad is concerned, they have come up with concrete steps, nothing that threatens. It has all, been very well, I think, communicated. So people largely, I think most interest groups within India feel very positively towards the Quad.
Perfect. Thank you. I personally feel that there needs to be a global shift where all countries need to start looking at trade negotiations from the perspective of consumers instead of the perspective of a small interest group, whether that is ag or tech or, all countries have interest group with in-house, and they always take the perspective of those interest groups, but it needs to sort of shift towards how does the consumer get benefited with trade. I'm going to ask a few questions from Sohail now, and then I would invite Mark to ask a question from Sohail as well, because he has a question on digital trade from Sohail. So Sohail, from your experience, two questions for you. First, what do you think is the future of WTO going forward for trade negotiations? Would the member countries take it seriously, or do you think that there's a shift towards bilateral because there is no interest in WTO, or is it the other way around? And the second question is, having dealt with Indian and American industry in India, where do you think the gap is on expectations on trade relations? What do you think the Indian industry has an expectation of the trade relation between India-US different from American industry's expectation from India-US trade relations? And then once you answer that question, as I said, I'll ask Mark to ask you the third question.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. Let me take the WTO issue first. And several of us, and Dr. Singh's on the call as well, and we've all had great hopes on what the WTO could bring. But honestly, several years later, the most successful part of the WTO was the dispute settlement process, which now, as we speak, is also broken down. Look at the concept of the WTO. You expect 160 odd countries around the world with different levels of development to come together and unanimously agree on trading rules. We have seen that there has been almost no consensus except, on trade facilitation in the past few decades, which were, really didn't do much for improving standards of living. And even today, WTO is talking about COVID vaccines and whatever else, but the action, for lack of a better word, is on the bilateral front. And that's something that I believe is here to stay. There are two types of trading partners that you will engage with. One is economies of similar standards. So ASEAN, being a case in point in Asia, where economies which largely the same sort of standard of living are trading with each other, or two, as we are seeing with India and the US, where economies of fundamentally different sizes and different levels of development are coming together on geopolitical realities. So I think WTO is going to be in a hiatus, for lack of a better word, for the short to medium term until these bilateral engagements gather speed and bring an increase in the standard of living. And don't get me wrong, I believe multilateralism will achieve that far easier, but I don't think anything's going to happen in the near future on that. The second point you asked me was on industry expectations from both sides of the spectrum in a India-US FTA. And I'd like to just, pick up the great point that Shamika made, that look, everybody has the desire, India-US. There's a lot of diaspora, there's a lot of synergy at the leadership levels, and there's geopolitical forces driving the trade relationship together. But the reality is that these are two vastly different economies. And honestly, it's not only that that industry needs to understand that, but trading partners need to understand that. So for several years, India was talking about free movement of people and whatever else. Of course, that's now really off the table, and we're talking about market access and other such more relevant issues. But the fact is that there are realities in India where you can just not go. Agriculture being one of them, strong domestic lobbies which will oppose issues because they have a lot to lose. They have been used to virtual monopoly or cartels operating in the domestic Indian economy, and they're very powerful and they will not relent that easily. Similarly, the US is used to a more open style of negotiations and discussions. And I just want to touch briefly upon the point that was made in one of the papers, that I think it was your paper, that while we have an Indian trade service, our bureaucracy is very hierarchical and very specialized. So we have a foreign service, we have the Indian administrative service, and we have a plethora of services below that. Today, trade negotiations are sitting squarely within the Commerce Ministry, and they consult with several stakeholders. But I think at the table for negotiations, we need a far more diverse set of people who can bring some urgency to the negotiations. And this, I think, industry can drive, and I hope they do drive this in a stronger way than they have been doing so far.
Thank you, Sohail. Mark Linscott, do you think you would want to ask a question? There he is. Perfect.
Sure. Hi. Thanks, Ritika. My apologies to everyone. I screwed up. I didn't register in advance, and so I hit a second Capucine. So, no. In fact, my question is not on digital specifically. I had posed an observation. I really enjoyed Sohail's point about trade being in traditional areas, with the exception of IT services. Yet, I think IT services has not blossomed as much as it could in terms of trade because they are misaligned on digital policies. But I agree completely with Shamika that we need to be realistic in terms of what can be accomplished in the short term. Now, my question is I guess a more fundamental one of incremental versus big. Each of us in the report lay out a case from different perspectives on incremental approaches. I have tended towards a view that don't talk big until we have incremental outcomes, that we build confidence first. But I'm starting to question that long-held assumption on my part, and I wonder whether I should tend towards Harsha, my esteemed friend Harsha Singh's perspective, that in fact we need to start big and then do it incrementally. Certainly the administration, the Biden administration, is not going to be announcing an FTA anytime soon because they aren't doing any FTAs for the time being. But I wonder if an agreement to move forward towards something bigger without specifying exactly what it is will provide more impetus to do the incremental outcomes in the shorter term. I mean, to devote more resources to the relationship and to prioritize the trade relationship more than has been the case. And, frankly, I think there is the technical capacity on the Indian side, although I agree with Ritika's point that there may need to be some institutional changes to prioritize trade. But you look at the WTO, which is most of my experience with India over a number of decades. India is very technically competent in the WTO. It devotes the resources to negotiations or to work in the WTO. From my perspective, it tends to be a disruptor, but it is highly competent in terms of WTO issues. It's really on the bilateral front that we see a lack of, resources being devoted. So my question is, does there need to be a focus on doing something bigger that will then get attention, that will make sure that both sides are prioritizing the trade relationship before they can actually start to get some incremental outcomes, which may seem a little backwards, but I am questioning myself on that issue, and I wonder what your perspectives are.
Thank you, Mark. Shamika, can we have you answer first, and then I'll go to Sohail for the same question.
So thank you, Mark. It's good to question yourself, but I must say I really enjoyed your chapter. And basically, the fundamental aspect of that chapter which stood out is the reality check of the situation. That we might want this relationship, we might want something significant and big, but we have been attempting it, Mark, for some time now. And I think that is where the need and where the weights are in favor of incrementalism is many times just the way India reforms and India's appetite for some of these agreements is such. So I think Quad is an example of what you just suggested, that perhaps we might be aligned on a larger sort of interest issue, and then we can work out the details. But given again the way reforms happen here, I'm extremely I'm not confident that India is likely to announce anything big without having enough details worked out. So it might still remain within the wraps, beyond the intent. So I think there is clear, when you see people, the politicians standing, shaking hands, wanting to do big agreements. I think the meeting of minds at that level has happened. We do want, I think India has made it, amply clear that we want to work towards fostering a stronger relationship. And you have seen that particularly with the Modi administration, vis-a-vis, let's say, the UPA, that, they have been willing to share some of the baggage to really showcase, the need and the willingness to have a closer relationship, a tie-up economic relationship with the US. And yet again, it's those details in terms of working out exact agreements, where the small frustrations sort of keep piling up. So I think, I still go back to, I wouldn't question your, fundamental assumption of the chapter. I really think that reality check is a good one for people in India as well. When you say that, look, it's not a priority for Biden administration. It's unlikely to announce an FTA. And I think that kind of a reality check also makes the Indian side perhaps focus on those small gains, which And there have been several positive cases, but I think we need to have many more of those, in the bag before we announce something big.
Thanks, Shamika. Sohail, any comments from you before I take questions from the audience? We barely have 5 minutes, so I'm just conscious of the time as well.
Yeah, I think we should just take questions from the audience. We have only 5 minutes. Let's take questions from the audience.
Sure.
Radhika, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So there is a question which I think has been addressed in the first half of our opening remarks, but I'm going to read that question anyway in case both you and Shamika have comments on that. So the question is, had there been no emergence of China as a threat to the US supremacy in global world order, would the US have been still interested in India as trading partner? In other words, how much the trading ties are byproduct of the US strategic interest in South Asia?
What a counterfactual question.
So, my view is that...
Sorry. So here, you can go ahead. Yeah. So here, you want to go first?
Let me become a little sort of India-centric and answer this question. Sure. With that in mind, can the US afford to ignore one of the largest markets in the world? I don't think so. And more importantly, China may be driving it faster, but I don't think that's the only reason why India and China ought to be engaging these. Some of the largest market afternoon in his press conference made a point saying that we are also two of the largest carbon polluters in the world, and we need to come together to solve the problem. So I don't think that's a China-related issue. I think, it's natural for large markets to come together.
Thank you. Thanks, Sohail. Shamika, your remarks on the question?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Sohail. I think, except, it's a counterfactual. It's much more of an academic exercise. I do think, given that China is the gorilla in the room, let's get down to the reality check that your report really, puts forth. We can go back to that later.
Fair. I don't see any questions in the chat box from the audience as of now, but if anybody has questions, please do type. We have another 2 minutes before we close the session. In case, Irfan, if you have any questions from both the panelists, now is the time to ask. Irfan, do you have any question?
Nothing from me, Radhika. Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. So I think we do have this opportunity to wrap up the session a minute and a half before the scheduled time. So that gives us time to go back to our next meetings if we have any. But I definitely want to thank Sohail and Shamika for their expert insight and comments on India-US trade relations. We got a perspective from an economist who has intensive research on this subject matter. And then we have a perspective from Sohail, who practices trade issues with his clients in India, potential investors and already investing companies. So I'm very sure that the audiences, including myself and Somaya and Irfan and Mark, we all learned a lot from your perspective, and it gives me some ideas to write my next article on trade relations between India and US. So I'm definitely going to come back to you on that with more perspective and insight, if that's okay with you. And thanks to Irfan and Atlantic Council for letting us host this event. Thank you so much, everybody.